Princess Beatrice has never been the most conventional of royals. Since her birth in 1988, the eldest daughter of Prince Andrew and Sarah Ferguson has walked a path that often straddled duty and independence. For many years, the world watched her grow up under the constant flash of cameras, carrying the weight of royal heritage while quietly trying to forge her own place beyond palace walls. Unlike her cousins, she was not sent directly into the most exclusive boarding schools, but instead began at St. George's School in Ascot before continuing on to Goldsmiths, University of London, where she studied history. From the start, her choices reflected a determination to define herself by more than her surname. After internships at Sony Pictures and work in finance and business development, Beatrice gradually built a professional identity that allowed her to live more like a modern working woman than a sheltered princess. When she moved to New York for a time, she lived almost anonymously under the name Beatrice York, blending into the city's rhythm while gaining professional experience. Even her relationships followed a similar pattern of independence, as her courtship with property developer Edoardo Mapelli Mozzi unfolded mostly out of the public eye, culminating in a small, intimate wedding during the pandemic in 2020. For Beatrice, charity work was never just about appearances either. She became a strong advocate for dyslexia awareness, drawing from her own experience, and she spoke about mental health and education with sincerity. To many observers, she embodied a kind of modern princess, still rooted in tradition, but approachable, relatable, and intent on balancing personal ambition with royal identity. Storm clouds gather. But even for royals who tried their hardest to live quietly, privacy has always been fragile, and in 2019, that fragility shattered for Princess Beatrice. Up until that point, she had succeeded in keeping her life relatively low profile. She had her career, her charitable projects, her marriage, and her young family. And though she attended official events, she had never been the sort of royal who courted publicity. That balance collapsed in July 2019, when American financier Jeffrey Epstein was arrested on charges of sex trafficking minors, a case that reopened a labyrinth of dark connections with influential men around the world. Very quickly, her father, Prince Andrew, became a central figure in the scrutiny. His long-noted association with Epstein had always raised questions, but now those questions turned into full-blown accusations, with newspapers publishing photographs, flight records, and testimony that placed him uncomfortably close to the scandal. The palace hoped at first that distance and silence would blunt the storm, but the pressure mounted until November 2019, when Andrew agreed to a televised interview on BBC's Newsnight. What was intended as a chance to explain himself turned into one of the most catastrophic moments in modern royal history. His awkward denials, vague explanations, and infamous claim that a victim could not be telling the truth because he could not sweat due to a medical condition provoked ridicule and outrage across the globe. Instead of clearing his name, he confirmed to the world just how disconnected he seemed from empathy and accountability. What was meant as damage control became a catastrophe, igniting fury and disbelief, and the monarchy's image, already fragile in a new century, was tarnished deeply. For Beatrice, who had worked so carefully to distance herself from scandal and controversy, it was as though the walls she had built for safety began to crumble overnight. A daughter's burden as the scandal deepened, culminating in January 2022, when a U.S. court allowed a civil lawsuit against Prince Andrew to proceed. The royal family's image fractured further, and the ripples reached Beatrice in ways she could never have anticipated. She had always tried to define herself outside of her royal title, pursuing a career, developing projects, and committing to causes like dyslexia awareness that were personal to her. But suddenly, her surname became a chain, dragging her into headlines that had nothing to do with her own choices. Friends and colleagues who had once spoken to her about work or charities now hesitated, their conversations punctuated by unspoken questions. Invitations shifted. Opportunities were quietly re-evaluated, and even casual interactions carried the subtle weight of discomfort. For Beatrice, who had grown up under the press's gaze, there was an understanding that public curiosity was part of the deal, but this was different. It was not the light speculation about fashion choices, holiday destinations, or relationships that she had endured as a teenager and young woman. This was a global scandal with serious legal undertones, a case so heavy it threatened to reshape the public's perception of her father forever. Beatrice could not separate herself from her father's name. No matter how carefully she built her own identity, the shadow of his scandal cast itself over her career and her family. The careful balance between duty and independence, between being a royal and being her own person, collapsed under the sheer force of events. Silence as a shield. Faced with the overwhelming scrutiny, Beatrice's first instinct was silence. She had watched as her father's words in interviews and statements had turned against him, fueling more outrage rather than easing it. If his every sentence was twisted, then what chance did she have of saying anything that would not be dissected or weaponized? Silence became her shield. It was not that she had nothing to say, but that she knew anything she did say would either be used to portray her as complicit and naive, or as disloyal and cold-hearted. If she defended him, critics would accuse her of ignoring victims. If she distanced herself, she would be branded as abandoning her father when he needed support most. Silence, fragile as it was, seemed to her the only possible way forward. But silence carried its own weight. Each day without words was another day of speculation, another whisper in the tabloids about what she was really thinking. The absence of her voice created a vacuum, and in that vacuum, assumptions flourished. Within the family, too, the bottled-up emotions began to press against the walls of duty. She lived with the gnawing realization that she could neither speak freely nor escape the consequences of being silent. It was a prison of restraint, with walls built not of stone, but of obligation, loyalty, and fear. The letter that changed everything. Then, just when it seemed her silence had sealed her off completely, came the revelation that shook both the palace and the public. Reports surfaced of a private letter written by Beatrice, a letter never intended for public eyes, quietly addressed to a friend, but somehow leaked into the media. At first, many doubted it was real. Beatrice had always been careful, discreet, and restrained, so the idea that she would pour her raw emotions into writing seemed almost unbelievable. Yet as the letter spread, the tone of its words made it unmistakably genuine. It was not written in the polished, calculated language of press releases. It was deeply personal, vulnerable, and filled with an honesty that no team of advisors could have manufactured. For the first time, people glimpsed Beatrice's inner turmoil, the side of her that lived behind closed doors when cameras were gone. She was no longer just a princess who kept her head down. She was revealed as a daughter in anguish, a woman navigating impossible contradictions, a mother worried for her child's future, and a person caught in the crossfire of scandal she had not created. The letter made her human in a way that resonated with the public more than any official statement could. A confession of pain. The most striking passages of the letter were those in which Beatrice wrote openly about the devastation her father's scandal had caused within her family. She admitted that she feared they would never truly recover, not only because of public opinion, but because of the gravity of the allegations themselves. She described the heartbreak of having worked so hard to build her own career and reputation, only to find her progress overshadowed by something she had no control over. She confessed that the family name, once carried with pride, now felt more like a burden, a weight that she bore unwillingly, yet could not set down. "It is as though the ground I built for myself has been taken away," she wrote, "and replaced with one that cracks beneath my feet every day." These words resonated with many because they captured not only the despair of a daughter, but also the fragility of identity when tied to a family defined by history. Beatrice's pain was not abstract. It was tangible, immediate, and deeply human. She was admitting that she had been robbed of her independence by the actions of someone else, her identity pulled back into the mud of scandal, despite her best efforts to remain apart. A princess torn. Perhaps the most unforgettable lines of the letter were those in which she described the impossible bind of loyalty. Beatrice made clear that she loved her father, not as a prince, not as a public figure, but as the parent who had raised her, supported her, and walked her down the aisle at her wedding. Yet that love was now tangled with fear, shame, and confusion. She admitted to sleepless nights wondering whether standing by her father meant betraying her own sense of integrity, and whether protecting her name meant betraying the man she still loved. For Beatrice, silence had not been indifference. It had been survival. And yet even silence could not keep her safe from the emotional toll. The man who had been her comfort was now the figure whose choices had brought chaos into her carefully built life. Reconciling the father she adored with the man described in global headlines was almost impossible, and the contradiction left her torn between love and disappointment, compassion and disillusionment. Her words did not provide answers, but they revealed the raw honesty of someone living with a contradiction that had no resolution. Public reaction. When the contents of the letter finally became public, reactions were immediate and intense. Some people expressed deep sympathy, recognizing in her words the agony of a daughter caught between family love and public scandal. To them, the letter was a brave act of humanity, proof that even within the gilded walls of royalty, people suffered the same impossible choices between love, loyalty, and integrity. Others, however, were more critical. They argued that the leak was a deliberate attempt to sway public opinion, or worse, a betrayal disguised as vulnerability. Tabloids had a field day, splashing her phrases across their covers and fueling debates on talk shows. Palace officials declined to comment, hoping silence might contain the flames. But the letter spoke louder than any denial or clarification. For Beatrice, the exposure confirmed her greatest fear. Even her most private confessions could be pulled into the public domain and dissected. Yet, paradoxically, her honesty touched many. People who had grown cynical about royalty found themselves moved by her humanity. She was no longer a quiet background figure, but a woman whose vulnerability made headlines. The letter transformed her in the public's eyes from a peripheral royal into a symbol of authenticity in an age of scandal. The weight of truth. In the end, the story of the leaked letter was not just about what Beatrice wrote, but about what it revealed: the cost of living at the intersection of public duty and private pain. It showed that for all the grandeur of titles and history, royals are not immune to heartbreak, shame, or fear. Beatrice's words crystallized the unique burden she carried. The knowledge that her family's scandal had permanently altered her future, reshaping how she would be seen in every room she entered, how her children might be judged, and how her own legacy would be shadowed by her father's choices. Yet, in her vulnerability, lay strength. By admitting her pain, she gave voice to the silent weight many children of disgraced parents carry, reminding the world that loyalty does not erase disappointment and that even love can live uneasily beside grief. For Beatrice, the future remained uncertain, but her letter had already reshaped her public identity. In her honesty, she found something rare: authenticity, the kind that cannot be faked and cannot be taken away, even in the most turbulent of storms. The cost of honesty. The fallout was not easy. Her words reignited debate about Andrew's scandal, reopening wounds the palace had tried to close. Yet, at the same time, her honesty gave her a new kind of credibility. People saw not just a princess, but a daughter, a wife, a mother, struggling to reconcile love, duty, and truth. It made her relatable in a way that few royals could ever be. But honesty came with a cost. Relationships within the family grew tense. Her confession, however private its intent, highlighted fractures in how the royals handled scandal. Some relatives may have wished she had remained silent. Others understood she had no choice but to let her truth slip through. A modern kind of princess. What emerged from the episode was a clearer portrait of who Princess Beatrice truly was. A modern royal, unwilling to let her life be defined entirely by duty or scandal. Her advocacy for dyslexia, her career pursuits, her commitment to a private family life, all of these now appeared in sharper relief against the backdrop of her father's controversies. If anything, her confession proved that she was not hiding behind her title, but confronting the cost of it. In speaking vulnerably, she reminded people that royals, however insulated, still experience fear, grief, and betrayal. A daughter's dilemma. Today, the story of Princess Beatrice's confession continues to resonate. She remains a figure of quiet dignity, still committed to her charitable causes, still protective of her family, yet forever changed by the public exposure of her private pain. Her words about carrying her family name like a weight echo far beyond the palace walls, reminding the world that royalty does not shield a person from heartbreak. If anything, it magnifies it. The scandal surrounding her father may continue to cast shadows, but Beatrice's willingness to show vulnerability has given her something rarer than privilege. It has given her authenticity. And in an era when the monarchy is constantly tested, authenticity may be the only thing that allows a princess to remain both royal and real. A letter. Too honest to ignore. The moment that changed everything for Princess Beatrice did not come with a speech at a podium or a carefully staged interview. Instead, it arrived quietly in the form of a leaked letter, private, heartfelt, and written with a vulnerability that felt too authentic to be staged. In her words, Beatrice admitted the deep devastation that the unfolding scandal surrounding her father had brought upon her family. She confessed that the storm would never fully pass because it was not a matter of bad press or simple mistakes. It was a situation severe enough to threaten her father's freedom and permanently stain her family name. She wrote that her surname, once carried with pride, now felt like a weight others twisted into a weapon. For years she had worked tirelessly to build an identity beyond her title, only to discover that a single headline could undo what she had spent decades constructing. Her words revealed the struggle of a daughter forced to live in two worlds at once: loyalty to a father she still loved, and compassion for victims whose stories could not be ignored. The burden of two worlds. Beatrice explained in her letter that the tension she carried was unbearable. She felt torn between protecting her father and remaining sensitive to the pain of those whose voices had filled headlines across the world. Every day she faced the reality that his actions, however explained or denied, had spilled over into her own life, affecting her children, her husband, and the reputation she had tried so carefully to protect. For the first time, she admitted her fear that her father's choices would permanently stain not just his legacy, but her own future. In the royal family, titles had long been seen as shields, armor that safeguarded generations. For Beatrice, that shield had become a target. She worried openly that she might never again walk into a room without sensing the silent connection in people's minds between her face and her father's scandal. And yet, despite her hurt, there was loyalty. Beneath her frustration lived an unshakable love for the man who raised her, a reminder that she still saw her father as more than the headlines. A Tale of Two Sisters. In the letter that rocked both the palace and the press, Princess Beatrice revealed not just her private pain, but also the very different ways she and her younger sister Eugénie had navigated the same crisis. Eugénie had chosen to remain visibly loyal, standing beside their father Prince Andrew at events when criticism was at its sharpest, her presence a quiet but forceful act of solidarity. She walked next to him into churches and family gatherings, even when photographers shouted questions that went unanswered, and her calm demeanor seemed designed to project strength in the face of relentless scrutiny. For Eugénie, loyalty was straightforward. She believed love meant showing up, no matter the cost, and her support was framed as both defiance of the press and compassion for a father she cherished. Beatrice, in contrast, had opted for silence, a decision many outsiders misinterpreted as weakness or hesitation. But her stillness was not indifference. It was the shield she raised to protect her husband and children from the firestorm consuming her family name. For Beatrice, the situation was layered with fear and responsibility. She knew that public gestures carried weight, and she recognized the cost of being seen too close to a man facing global outrage. Her silence, though painful, was an act of survival. The leaked letter underscored this divide. Beatrice's words admitted love for her father, but also questioned the decisions that had led him to a place where his name dominated scandalous headlines. It became a poignant reminder that loyalty does not always mean agreement, and that even within the tightest families, love can fracture into different expressions of support. The press eruption. When the letter reached the press, the reaction was immediate and ferocious. Newspapers seized upon every phrase, splashing her words across front pages in bold type that stripped away the privacy Beatrice had hoped to maintain. Tabloids ran commentaries dissecting her tone, debating whether her confession was an act of betrayal or of bravery. Some columnists accused her of weakening the family's united front, suggesting that by admitting the personal toll, she had inadvertently added fuel to the fire engulfing her father. Others praised her honesty, noting that she was the first senior royal to openly acknowledge the human cost of the Epstein scandal within palace walls. The palace itself offered no comment, hoping silence might cool the frenzy, but the letter spoke louder than any official statement could. For Beatrice, the exposure was devastating, confirming her worst fear, that even her most intimate feelings could be dragged into public spectacle. Yet, paradoxically, her honesty resonated deeply with many readers who saw in her words the raw truth of a daughter struggling between loyalty to a father and loyalty to her own integrity. For the first time, people glimpsed a royal not behind the protective screen of protocol, but as a human being acknowledging the private wounds inflicted by public scandal. The collapse of a prince. As debate swirled around Beatrice's words, her father's downfall accelerated with a speed and severity that stunned even seasoned royal watchers. By early 2022, Prince Andrew's once untouchable status had disintegrated. For decades he had lived under the shield of privilege. Military titles, honorary patronages, and the style of His Royal Highness gave him an aura of permanence. But in January that year, Queen Elizabeth summoned her son to Windsor Castle. In a meeting that insiders described as painfully direct, he entered the castle a prince of the realm, and left stripped of nearly all the ceremonial honors that had defined his public life. Military affiliations were removed, patronages rescinded, and even the right to use his royal style in an official capacity was revoked. For the monarchy, it was a decisive act of self-preservation, an acknowledgement that the crown could not endure unless it distanced itself from the scandal. For Andrew, it was humiliation, and for his daughters, it was a brutal reminder of how quickly privilege could evaporate when public trust collapsed. The announcement, released almost immediately after the Windsor meeting, signaled that even the Queen's loyalty to family had limits when the institution itself was at risk. Exile from influence. The consequences of Andrew's fall rippled quickly across the networks that had once embraced him. Charities severed ties, universities ended partnerships, and corporate patrons withdrew their support. His flagship initiative, Pitch at Palace, once a prestigious program connecting entrepreneurs with investors, crumbled under the weight of reputational damage. Financial whispers soon followed. How would Andrew pay for the mounting legal costs without the cushion of public roles and private patronage? Reports surfaced of property sales and quiet financial settlements arranged behind the scenes. The prince, who once mingled effortlessly among global elites, attending gala dinners and international forums, now found his life shrinking, both socially and professionally. For Beatrice, watching her father's identity unravel was profoundly painful. The man she had known in private as a parent and protector was becoming, in the public eye, a figure cast out from influence, defined not by his service, but by his scandal. The stain of his name seeped into her own professional life, complicating every step she had taken to forge her independence. The streamlined monarchy. Andrew's downfall reshaped not only his life, but also the monarchy itself. For years, then, Prince Charles had spoken of the need for a slimmed-down monarchy, one focused tightly on the direct line of succession. The scandal gave this vision urgency. From that point forward, every royal appearance had to be justified. Every public role had to reflect genuine service. Extended family members were no longer seen as assets, but as risks. The visual symbol of this change appeared most clearly on the balcony of Buckingham Palace during Trooping the Colour, where the lineup grew noticeably smaller. The monarchy's public image narrowed to Charles, William, Catherine, George, and a handful of trusted figures like Princess Anne. Even beloved royals had to shoulder heavier workloads to fill the space left by Andrew's absence. Internally, the shift was painful. The Queen, who had spent her reign balancing duty with devotion to family, had been forced to publicly distance herself from her own son. Charles and William, aligned in their determination to protect the institution, pressed forward with discipline, while other family members wrestled with the emotional cost of putting survival before sentiment. The message was clear and unmistakable. The monarchy would protect itself first, even if it meant cutting away its own flesh. Family in the shadows. Behind the grandeur of official statements, the personal cost for the York family was staggering. Beatrice and Eugénie, once the daughters of a popular and visible prince, now had to adjust to the reality that their father's public identity was gone, and with it, much of their own standing in the royal hierarchy. Every family gathering carried an unspoken tension. At Christmas in Sandringham or summer at Balmoral, conversations were careful, laughter quieter, the weight of scandal always hovering. Sarah Ferguson, the Duchess of York, once divorced and long considered an outsider, re-emerged in an unusual role as defender of Andrew. Her continued closeness to him drew criticism, but she refused to abandon him, framing her loyalty as an act of compassion rather than defiance. For her daughters, this complicated dynamic offered both comfort and frustration, showing that even within fractured families, bonds do not disappear simply because titles do. The Yorks, once peripheral but still proud members of the wider Windsor circle, now lived with the shadow of scandal, shaping every public and private moment. The human cost of loyalty. For Beatrice, the hardest lesson was one she put into her own words. Titles could not protect against disgrace, and family ties could be stretched, but not severed by scandal. She had grown up believing that the monarchy was too solid to be shaken, but now she saw that even centuries-old traditions could bend to public outrage. In her letter, she admitted her greatest fear, that her father's actions had seeped into her own identity, threatening the legacy she hoped to pass on to her daughter. She worried aloud that her child would grow up judged for mistakes that were not hers to bear, forever associated with a surname tarnished by scandal. Yet, even as she confessed this dread, Beatrice also insisted on her unyielding love for her father. She remembered the man who held her hand at her wedding, who read bedtime stories in her childhood, who was not the headline figure but the parent she still cherished. The paradox of love and disappointment, of loyalty and grief, formed the core of her struggle. It was not a contradiction, but a truth, that one can love a person deeply while mourning the damage their choices have caused. The future unwritten. Today, the story of Princess Beatrice's confession continues to echo beyond the palace walls, serving as both a family drama and a reflection of the monarchy's challenges in a modern world. Her leaked words exposed the fragile balance between tradition and accountability, between the institution's survival and the humanity of those born into it. The scandal surrounding Prince Andrew forced the monarchy to streamline and redefine its purpose for a new era. For Beatrice, it served as a reminder that no matter how carefully she built her life outside the palace, she would always be tethered to her family name. Yet by showing vulnerability, she gained something rare for a royal: authenticity. In an age when the monarchy is constantly tested by questions of relevance,